Welcome back to more of the Eden of Grisaia. Here we are, Kazuki's recounting her tale of what actually happened after Amane had left to find help. How many days had passed since the accident anyway? I couldn't remember off the top of my head. The question was beginning to feel pointless. Pushing my way through the thick undergrowth, I followed the barely visible trail that led to the burial ground Amane and I had visited last night. Or the gravesite, as Sakashita had called it. Given that we'd all be ending up here sooner or later, the idea of paying it a visit wasn't particularly appealing. And in my weakened state, the slight uphill slope proved a tedious challenge. Eventually, the uphill path came to an end, and a level clearing came into view. As I drew closer, I could hear the sound of someone digging with a shovel. Of course, the responsible party was Mr. Ochi. His shirt was plastered to his back with sweat. After glancing briefly in my direction, he turned back to his digging without meeting my gaze. In a sense, it seemed rather impressive that he still had the energy to be digging holes. But then again, when your accumulated fatigue passes a certain threshold, your body sometimes grows numb to the fact that it's exhausted. In this place, chosen as a burial ground simply because the ground was somewhat softer, 5 graves have already been dug. Of course, they were nothing but simple unmarked mounds of earth. Their main purpose was to prevent infection, not to memorialize the dead. 5 mounds of earth, 5 graves. And lying in the grass next to Ochi, who was digging a new hole, were the bodies of Sakuma Minori and Ibuki Haruna. The 2 corpses, stretched out next to each other, were already surrounded by a swarm of flies. If we left them exposed, they would be infested with maggots within a day, and as they rotted, the bodies would become hotbeds of disease, potentially harming those of us still living. The 2 of them had been placed quite carefully in the grass. Their hands were folded in front of their chests. Had Mr. Ochi done that? Sakuma Minori had died from a stab to the gut. Haruna Ibuki had died from a blow to the head caused by Mr. Ochi himself. I felt very bad about that. But right now, there was no trace of pain or bitterness on their faces. At this, Ochi paused in his labors and turned to stare at me. I suppose it would be more accurate to say that he was staring at the mess kit in my hands. He spoke 2 quiet words. And stuck his shovel in the ground and accepted the food from me. Finding a spot in the shade of a rock wall, Ochi sat down with his back against it, slightly opened the mess kit, and began to eat the thin gruel, flavored only with a pinch of salt. As those words left my mouth, Ochi visibly flinched. Perhaps he was bracing himself for a torrent of condemnation and reproach. Instead, I summarized the condition of the wounded and briefed him on our current food supply. Every word I spoke concerned the present. I didn't lament on the past, or criticize the choices we'd made. I didn't express my fear of the future, or ask him how we might survive this horrible situation. I spoke of the present and nothing else. Mr. Ochi, for his part, listened silently as he ate, saying nothing at all. Eventually, after his metal spoon had repeatedly scraped against the bottom of the mess kit, Ochi appeared at least somewhat sated. Looking up at me, he murmured a few quiet words. No, we don't hate you, Mr. Ochi. You know, in the first game, when you did this, Mr. Ochi was kind of made into some kind of horrible monster that was like sleeping with the girls and eating the bodies and stuff, and it was, you know, he was deemed into some kind of irredeemable creature, you know. But, you know, now we kind of see, you know, he really regrets what he did, you know. He feels bad for what he did, and he knows that he only did it because, you know, people go crazy when they're desperate.
渋滞を嫌って予定にない道を選んだのも俺だ。それにあれ最初に手を伸ばしたのも俺だ。どうしても空腹には逆らえなかった。頭では分かっていてもどうすることもできない。だから俺は最低の行為を繰り返した。でもある日それを坂下に見られてしまったんだ。俺はね、坂下に頬を張られたよ。だけど彼女はその後怒鳴り散らすでもなく、ただ無言で涙を流して下唇を噛みながら俺を睨むだけなんだ。きっと坂下の喉からは恥を知りなさいって言葉が口まで出かかっていたんだと思う。俺はもう頭の中がぐちゃぐちゃになって情けなくて恥ずかしくて惨めで、いい年をした大人の男が年はもゆかない女の子の足にしがみついて何度も何度も許してくれって、どうしようもないことだと分かっていてもどうすることもできなかった。誰にもどうすることもできなかったんだ。ああするしかなかったんだ。だから坂下のことは恨まないでやってほしい。悪いのは全部俺なんだ。
どうして今そんな話を？
I think he's telling her this because he just doesn't want, he doesn't want himself to die, and everyone thinking that he was some inhuman monster.
どうせも誰も助からない。この世の終わりの先にあの世があるかどうかなんて俺にもわからないけれど、もしそんな世界があるとしたのなら、俺の行く先は地獄と呼ばれるような場所だろう。だったらせめて坂下は悪くなかったと、あいつは立派な部長だったのだと、ただそれだけのエゴだよ。
There was no need to be worried about any of that. Once you're dead, everything's over. If anything, we should be concerned ourselves with the effect the rumors we're going to have on the families we leave behind. Also, I didn't hate Captain Sakashita nearly as much as people seem to think. In fact, I actually identified with her in some respects, particularly the way she'd been arbitrarily branded as a cold person. Most people form their opinions of her solely on that basis, instead of trying to understand her. Even if they're simple school clubs, organizations of any size always need a scary person or two. By playing that role, she'd maintained order on the team. She could be excessively harsh to the other team members, and to some degree, this was just a part of presenting herself as a leader, but in time, she'd come to understand that her role came with real responsibilities. I'll take responsibility. Speaking those words had clearly been satisfying for her, but they'd also added to the weight bearing down on her shoulders. In the last few days, an impossibly heavy burden had thrown itself at her feet, weeping and begging. Ochi had broken under unspeakable stress. It would have been impossible to comfort him with words alone. She'd probably chosen to directly accept his desperate lust for survival in the only way that she could. When I tried to imagine Sakashita's emotional state at the time, I felt genuine sympathy for her. And of course, once the dam was broken, she was simply borne along by the flood like everybody else. However, if the truth of what happened here ever became public, she was through. The pity and scorn of strangers would haunt her for the rest of her days. Under those circumstances, it was a small wonder that she had seen my attempt to escape with Amani as unforgivable. Her irritation at the more freewheeling members of the team was simply understandable. Once her emotions reached a boiling point, she had been unable to tolerate Tsukuma-senpai and her apparent irresponsibility. No matter what the circumstances, the things Sakashita had done were unforgivable. But even so, I had a certain respect for her, and I believed there was kindness in her heart. I certainly didn't want to be her friend, but if she'd ever been placed on trial for her crimes, I would willingly have testified for her defense.
何やら先生はすっかり諦めムードが濃厚なご様子ですが、まだ助かる見込みはあります。
もう、そういう気休めは聞き飽きたよ。
昨夜、私が逃がした周防あまねがまだ戻ってきません。彼女がうまく脱出に成功すれば。
うまく脱出できる可能性はどれくらいと見積もっている？
正直な数字を聞きたいですか？
どれぐらいだ？
10%。
That's not good.
期待するには低すぎる数字だな。
確かに極めて可能性は低いです。正直偶然に期待するしかないでしょう。ちなみに先生が脱出を試みられた時、私はもう少し高い数字で期待していました。
すまない。
別に責めているわけではありません。先生には体力的な期待と地元とは言わないまでも多少なりとも地理的な知識があるとの判断で数字を高く見積もっていただけです。
確かにね。知っている道がすぐそばにある。俺の実家はここから約50キロ圏内だし、学生時代は車で毎日のように通った道だ。けどね、その知っている道があるという過信が良くなかった。きっとこっちだ、多分あっちだと勘を頼りに歩いているくせに、妙な確信のようなものに引っ張られて間違った道をどんどん進む。このまま進めば夏に大学のサークルでキャンプしたキャンプ場に出るはず。キャンプ場に出られれば助かるかもしれない。そんな風に間違った道を延々と進む。間違っていることに気がついてもそれを認めることができない。認める勇気がない。結局は見覚えのある場所をぐるぐると回るだけ。それなら知らない道と割り切って迷わずまっすぐ突き進む方がマシ。
先生？
Oh no, is he okay?
先生！
大丈夫だ。慣れてる。もうずいぶん前からこんな調子で。
Does he have some kind of infection?
いつ頃から？
ここを出て一人で救助を求めに出た時に口にした木の実が原因かもしれない。最初はうまいうまいと食っていたが、1時間もすると腹に火がついたみたいに痛くなって、夜明けまで何度も吐いたんだ。それ以来時々こうして痛みがぶり返す。
Does he have an ulcer or something?
出発前に鳥が食わないような木の実は食うなと風見に忠告されたが、その通りだったな。
先生、少し見せてもらってもよろしいですか？まずは目を見せてください。
Holding Ochi's puffy eyelids open with my fingers, I peered in to examine his eyeball. Next, I pulled on his rough, cracked upper lip. Both his eyes and gums were showing clear signs of jaundice.
循環器かもしれませんね。
That's not good. The extreme stress he was under was probably a factor. It might be some sort of virus, but the first thing that came to mind
何
was...
か変わったものを食べましたか？
さっき言った通り木の実を食べた。赤い実で中にコーヒー豆のような大きな種があった。
I mean, you have been eating people, right? I mean, that probably doesn't help. Could that really be the cause?
下痢をしていますか？
もうずいぶん前からね。
That's not good.
時々真っ赤な便が出る。
尿の方はどうですか？
なんだかひどく茶色い小便が出る。
お腹を見せていただけますか？
ああ。
When Ochi lifted up his shirt, I saw that his stomach was horribly distended. It seemed impossible that eating some strange fruit could have caused symptoms like these. Which meant...
どうしてもっと早く言ってくれなかったんですか？
早く言えばどうにかなったのか。
That wasn't what I meant. For the last few days, he'd been involved in preparing the food and distributing it to others.
私が言いたいのは、これが感染症だったら他の子たちも危険だということです。
Evidently at a loss for words, Mr. Ochi hung his head in crestfallen silence.
私とアマネ以外は鹿肉を口にしています。他の子たちにも感染しているかもしれません。なんとか治療法を考えないと。
俺の治療はもういい。これは運命というよりは天罰なのだろう。生き残す価値のある人間だけを救えばいい。どうせ死ぬなら楽に死にたいと考えるような俺のような人間にその価値はない。俺はやれるだけのことをやってここで死ぬよ。
やれるだけのこと？
埋めるのさ、死体を。ここで起きたことを外に漏らさないためにね。
Bad premonitions tend to be the most reliable by far. And in this particular case, my fears proved remarkably accurate. Mr. Ochi's illness spread to all of the other team members. Over the next 2 to 4 days, they all died, leaving only the 2 of us alive. The first to go was Captain Sakashita. I immediately returned to her tent after realizing Ochi's condition, and found her only half conscious. She was running a fever and showed signs of jaundice. When she woke a number of times over the next few hours, she wasn't able to answer my questions about her condition. The most she could manage was to close her eyes and whisper no, when I asked her if she was dead. Eventually, she no longer responded to anything I said. Flies began to swim around her as if smelling her impending death in the air. And a few hours after, with her eyes open just a sliver, she stopped even blinking. In the end, Captain Sakashita died in that tent without even touching the last serving of rice I'd left her at her bedside. As if taking their cue from the captain, the others began to die in quick succession. The next to go was Koiri Ritsu. Unable to keep down anything, even small sips of liquid, she had nonetheless thirsted for water. I found her lying dead next to a small stream. Her body showed signs of jaundice as well. Although it wasn't the immediate cause of her death, the disease was clearly to blame. Although I'd initially expected Kanade-senpai to die right off the bat, she'd clung to life with remarkable persistence. Still, in time I could tell that her condition had begun to deteriorate. It was impressive that she'd lasted this long, and I tried to encourage her by telling her how lucky she was. But her end arrived with surprising suddenness. She had been holding an ordinary conversation with me only 10 minutes before, and now she was dead. Her body had lost a great deal of fluid, and she was severely malnourished, not to mention ravaged by disease. Perhaps it had simply grown sick of struggling to function.
というわけで、結局生き残ったのは私と先生だけになってしまいました。
そうか。
With that brief reply, Mr. Ochi rose from the rock he'd been sitting on and picked up the shovel he'd stuck into the
ま
ground.
た穴を掘って埋めるのですか？
ああ、そうだ。だが埋める前に遺体をバラバラにする。
どういうことです？
ここであったことは誰にも知られてはならない。
Lifting up his shovel, Mr. Ochi stabbed down onto one of the corpses.
俺が今していることは人として最低な行為だ。
Once again, he swung his shovel.
バラバラにした死体を組み替えて一人ずつ数を揃えて赤穴に埋める。
He swung again with all of his might.
そうすればここで起きた出来事は
So he was hoping to hide the ugliest parts of the truth. Cutting apart the bodies would increase their cross-sectional area, promoting rapid decomposition. Lacerations and other wounds would become impossible to detect, and they might assume that any broken bones had occurred during the process of dismemberment. Even if something seemed a bit unusual, they might simply conclude that wild animals had carried off parts of the corpses.
残念ですが、人参の数をごまかすようにはうまくいきません。発見された遺体が不自然に損壊されている時点で、調査当局は DNA 鑑定を依頼するでしょう。そうなれば数が足りていないことは容易に発覚しますし、偽装があったことでより深く調査が行われ、結果全てが発覚してしまいます。
それはそれで構わないさ。こうして遺体に偽装しているのは俺だ。いずれは俺も死ぬ。俺が死んで俺の死体がバラバラでなければ俺が犯人ということだ。ここで起きた出来事は
He wants to go down taking all the
全
blame.
部俺の責任になる。それでいい。
それが先生に残されたやるべきことですか？
そういうことだ。風見、もし君が死んだら君の死体もバラバラにするつもりだ。今のうちに謝っておくよ。すまない。
もし先生の方が先にお亡くなりになったら、もしくはほぼ同時に死んだらどうするおつもりですか？
その時はシャベルを握ったまま死んでいる奴が犯人だ。俺はこのシャベルを死んでも離さない。
そううまくいくとも思えませんけど。
俺のことなんかより風見にもやるべきことがあるんじゃないか？
ありません。
What else is there to do? There's no one left.
きっぱり言い切ったな。風見はずっとそうだったな。君のそういうところがまるで理解できなかった。いや、俺は部員たちの誰も理解していなかったし、そもそも理解するつもりがなかったんだろうな。
We could communicate perfectly well, but none of us had made the effort to understand each other. And so we never learned to trust each other. It wasn't just true of Mr. Ochi. The same could be said of everyone on the team. But even if every one of us had understood and trusted every other member of the group, I'm not about to suggest that we would have survived. For a very long time, humanity's been telling itself that war will die out once we learn to trust each other and talk things through. And in all those years, there's never been a single day in which the world was free of bloodshed. But as for things I left undone, The only thing that really came to mind was to prepare for the remote possibility that Amane would return to this place. On the memo I'd given to her, there was an item titled, "If you fail to escape," including a map to the spot where I'd buried some emergency rations on the very day of the accident. Part of the reason I defended Sakashita for hiding away a secret stash of food was that I'd done the exact same thing myself.
そうね。アマネが戻ってきてしまった時、私が生きている保証もないし、伝言ぐらいは残しておくべきかしら。
At this point, it seemed like the only task I'd left outstanding. Taking a small notebook from among Koide-san's personal possessions, I carefully ripped out 2 pages of paper. On the first leaf, I wrote a letter for the scenario in which she failed to escape. To my dear best friend Suamane, since you're reading this letter, I'm afraid it seems that you've returned to this hellish place once more. And unfortunately, I'm no longer here to help you. If things went as planned, I'd probably been cut up into pieces and buried. But if that isn't the case, you might be reading this in front of my corpse. Should the latter be true, and I've died an unsightly death with my eyes half open, I'd appreciate it if you tried not to stare. Also, you're officially forbidden from succumbing to despair. I expect you to survive until the very end. In order to facilitate this, I've left you all the food I can. I sincerely hope that will arrive this time, and that you'll leave this forest alive. On that note, if you do manage to survive, I have a favor to ask of you. It concerns my little brother. Now that I'm gone, our house will no longer be a home for him. If you can possibly do so, I want you to save him. My Yuji's a cowardly little crybaby. His kindness is about all he has going for him. Bit of a hopeless boy, really. Even so, he's my one and only brother. And I love him very much. Leaving him is my only regret. Yuji needs a reliable woman by his side. He's the sword who can't manage anything alone. If at all possible, I'd like you to take care of him. To take my place as his big sister. Well then, now that I've made my final request, I expect you to struggle stubbornly until the bitter end. Respectfully yours, the greatest friend of your life, Kazami Kazuki. P.S. Now that you've read this letter, please dispose of the other one without reading it.
まあ、こんなところかな。
Next, on the second leaf, I wrote a letter for the scenario in which her escape was successful. To my dear best friend Suamane. First of all, congratulations on getting out alive. If you're reading this letter, I expect several years have passed since the accident, and you're finally beginning to calm down and face up to what occurred here. I'm sure you opened this box in search of answers and an explanation of the events after your escape. Therefore, I'll now give you the executive summary. Everyone died from illness. Surprised? Well, I should think so. Very well then, I'll give you a short rundown of the particulars. The trigger of these events, that is to say the ultimate cause of their deaths, was eating improperly prepared meat. Any animal carries its share of dangerous bacteria and germs within its body, and I'm afraid this one was consumed under unsanitary conditions. As a result, the group experienced an abrupt outbreak of acute internal disease. Symptoms include shivers, vertigo, fatigue, as well as diarrhea and the dehydration that accompanied it. Within 2 to 4 days of sickening, nearly all were dead. The one who truly saved your life might as well have been the germs swarming over the meat. But I know your gentle heart. I'm sure you're giving all of the credit to your dear friend Kazami Kazuki, who offered up her body to protect you. I'm sure you've offered me many tearful thanks. Therefore, I've got a favor to ask of you. If my little brother has lost his way, if he's suffering alone, I want you to find him and help him. My Yuji's a cowardly little crybaby. His kindness is about all he's going for him. Bit of a hopeless boy, really. Even so, he's my one and only brother, and I love him very much. Leaving him is my only regret. If Yuji happens to be standing next to you as you read this, he's a very fortunate young man. He needs a reliable woman by his side. He's the sort who can't manage anything alone. If possible, I'd like you to watch over my little brother forever. Well then, so long as we're both alive, let's meet again here. Somewhere, someday. Respectfully yours, the greatest friend of your life, Kazami Kazuki.
さすがに感染症とか 殺し合いで死人が出たとか書けないわよね。
Most likely Amane would be reading this letter years from now when she was finally coming to terms with her past. At that point, informing her just how horrible things had turned out in the end would probably be a bit too cruel.
あ、そうか。
As I imagined the circumstances in which Amane might be reading the second letter, a vague point of concern floated through my mind. It was unpleasant to contemplate, but there was a possibility that the bereaved families would direct their anger and hatred at her as the sole survivor of this disaster. Perhaps an additional note was warranted. P.S. If by some chance you currently find yourself in a life or death situation, take the attached kitchen knife and please do your best to eliminate the threat by your own power. I can no longer save you. Believe in a happier tomorrow. If necessary, fight for it. I firmly believe that you're capable of blazing your own path forward. No matter how great the obstacles in your way, even if you feel just about ready to die, so long as you refuse to give up, it'll work out somehow. As an expression of those feelings more than anything else, I decided to leave the knife I'd taken from Amane along with the letters.
あとはこれを食料の隠し場所に埋めるだけ。
For my own stash, I simply buried Ozawa Senpai's overnight bag in the ground. After digging it up, I transferred its contents to the cooler Sakashita had used, then added my letters as well. The first letter I dropped in unprotected, the second I placed inside a piece of airtight plastic Tupperware. This way, if Amane successfully escaped and came back years from now, the slow seeping of moisture into the cooler would have destroyed the first letter. If she returned in the next few days, the first letter would be easier to find, and it instructed her to dispose of the second. I had every confidence that Amane would do so without hesitation. After placing the letters and the knife in the cooler, I proceeded to bury it anew, and by the time it was securely hidden in the earth, I had expended the very last of my strength. Utterly exhausted, I lay down on my side and waited quietly for the end to come.